The mountains stretched endlessly, their peaks covered in a thick blanket of snow. Tucked within this vast wilderness was a quiet village, barely touched by time. Life here moves slowly, the people living off the land. Their days dictated by the changing seasons. Among them was an old widow named Margaret, who lived on the outskirts far from the center of the village. Her home was a simple wooden cabin built by her late husband. Decades ago, the house had withstood the harsh winters in the weight of many years. Much like Margaret herself, she had not always been alone. Once laughter had filled the walls of her home, and warmth had come not just from the fire in the hearth, but from the presence of her husband and son. But time had stolen both from her. Her husband had passed away many years ago, leaving her with only memories and a heart weighed down by loss. Their son David had grown restless in the quiet village and left for the city in search of a better life. At first he would visit, sending letters filled with promises to return. But as the years passed, those letters became fewer until they stopped entirely. Now Margaret spent her days in solitude. She woke up before sunrise, preparing tea from dried herbs. She gathered herself, her wrinkled hands moved with practiced ease, tending to her small vegetable garden, chopping firewood, and mending worn-out clothes. She had grown used to the silence, but some days it felt unbearable. The village was kind to her, but people rarely visited. They respected her independence, admiring the way she had survived on her own. For so long, evenings were the hardest. As the sun dipped behind the mountains, casting long shadows over the land, Margaret would sit by the window, gazing at the vast wilderness. Beyond, the loneliness settled in, like the cold creeping into her bones. Sometimes she spoke out loud just to hear a voice, even if it was only her own. The nights were eerily quiet, broken only by the howling wind or the distant call of wolves. Margaret had long stopped fearing the wilderness. She had lived among it for years, understanding its dangers and respecting its rules. Yet deep inside, she wished for someone to break the silence. As winter approached, the days grew shorter, and the night stretched endlessly. Margaret prepared for the harsh season, stacking firewood and preserving food. The village would soon become buried under thick layers of snow, cutting them off from the outside world. She had survived many winters alone, and she was prepared to endure another. But fate had other plans, unbeknownst to her. Something was about to change, something wild, something unexpected. Soon her lonely cabin would no longer be just hers. Soon the silence that had weighed on her heart for years would be broken, and it would all begin with a helpless creature on the brink of death. The winter storm arrived earlier than expected. Thick flakes of snow drifted down from the sky, covering the landscape in a heavy white blanket. The wind howled through the trees, rattling the windows of Margaret's cabin. She wrapped herself in an old wool shawl and placed another log onto the fire, watching the flames dance. Just as she was settling in for the evening, a sound outside made her pause. It was faint at first, barely audible over the roaring wind, but it was there, a desperate, pitiful cry. Margaret's brows furrowed. It was not the sound of a wolf or any familiar animal from the forest. It was different. Weak, helpless curiosity and concern stirred within her as she reached for her lantern and pulled on her boots. The cold bit into her skin. The moment she stepped outside, the snow was deep, her feet sinking with each careful step. She followed the sound, her heart pounding against her ribs. Then she saw it, half buried in the snow, curled up into a shivering ball. Was a tiny creature. As she moved closer, realization struck her. It was a bear cub. Margaret's breath caught in her throat. The cub was small, too small to be on its own. Its fur was damp with melting snow, and its body trembled violently. Its mother was nowhere to be seen, and Margaret knew what that meant. The cub had been abandoned, or worse, its mother had not survived the brutal winter. She hesitated. She knew the dangers of wild animals, especially bears. Even a cub could grow into something powerful, something uncontrollable. But as she looked into its wide, frightened eyes, Something inside her softened. It was just a baby alone in the cold, just as she was. Without another thought, she carefully lifted the tiny creature into her arms. It was lighter than she expected, its ribs showing through its thin fur. The cub barely had the strength to resist her touch, its head LED against her chest, as she turned and trudged back to her cabin, shielding it from the wind. Once inside, she placed the cup near the fire, wrapping it in an old blanket. It made a weak, soft sound, its tiny paws twitching. Margaret hurried to warm some milk, pouring it into a small bowl. She sat beside the cub, dipping her fingers into the liquid before gently pressing them against its mouth. At first the cub was too weak to respond, but after a few moments it licked the milk from her fingers. Encouraged, Margaret carefully tipped the bowl to its lips. Slowly but surely the cup drank, its fragile body regaining some warmth. Margaret watched it with quiet amazement. She had spent so many years alone, speaking to no one but herself in the trees. But now, here was this small, helpless creature relying on her for survival. A faint smile touched her lips as she stroked its fur, feeling its tiny heartbeat beneath her fingers. "You are a fighter, little one," she murmured, her voice soft. The cub let out a quiet huff, curling deeper into the warmth of the blanket. Margaret knew that she had just changed the course of both their lives. What she did not know was that this was only the beginning. The first few days were difficult. The cub was weak, barely able to lift its head, but Margaret refused to give up on him. She kept him wrapped in warm blankets by the fire, feeding him small amounts of milk throughout the day. At night, she would wake up just to check if he was still breathing, a strange sense of responsibility settling in her heart. Slowly, the cub gained strength. His tiny legs, once too feeble to support his weight, began to move with determination. He would wobble around the small cabin, sniffing at the wooden floor and bumping into furniture. His clumsiness made Margaret chuckle, something she had not done in years, as the days passed. The cub became more active, following Margaret everywhere she went when she tended to her vegetable garden. He would sit nearby, watching her with curious eyes. If she went to gather firewood, he would waddle after her, struggling through the deep snow. He was still small, but there was a quiet strength in him. One evening, as she sat by the fire, she finally spoke aloud. The thought that had been forming in her mind. "Bruno," she said softly. The cub lifted his head at the sound of her voice, his dark eyes meeting hers. "That will be your name," she murmured, watching as he let out a small huff, almost as if he understood. From that moment on, Bruno was no longer just a wild animal, he was hers. The village was skeptical when they learned of Margaret's unusual companion. People warned her that she was making a mistake, that a bear could never be truly tamed. They told her that one day he would turn on her. But Margaret did not listen. She had seen the fear in Bruno's eyes when she first found him, felt the way he pressed against her for warmth. Bruno was different. As the weeks turned into months, Bruno grew rapidly. His once tiny paws became large and powerful, his fragile frame filling out with thick muscle. But despite his increasing size, his bond with Margaret never changed. He remained gentle with her, careful not to knock her over when he nudged her for attention. He would curl up beside her chair, resting his head on her lap as she ran her wrinkled fingers through his fur. Margaret began to notice how intelligent he was. He learned to recognize her routine, knowing when it was time to fetch water from the well, or when she would sit on the porch in the evening. Sometimes she would catch him watching her with an expression that seemed almost human. Winter melted into spring, and with it, Bruno became even more of a presence in Margaret's life. He was no longer just a cub. He was a towering creature, strong enough to snap a tree branch with a single swipe. Yet never once did he show aggression toward her. If anything, he became her silent protector. One afternoon, as Margaret was chopping firewood, a pack of wolves approached the edge of her land. She did not see them at first, too focused on her task, but Bruno did before she even realized what was happening. Bruno moved in front of her, standing on his hind legs. A deep growl rumbled from his chest, sending a clear message to the intruders. The wolves hesitated, their yellow eyes watching him wearily. Then, as if sensing they were no match for the giant bear, they turned, and disappeared into the trees. Margaret's breath was caught in her throat. She slowly reached out, placing a hand on Bruno's thick fur. "You saved me," she whispered. Bruno let out a low grunt, his large head pressing gently against her shoulder. It was in that moment Margaret understood. Bruno was more than just a bear she had raised. He was her family, but deep down she knew that nothing stayed the same forever, and one day everything would change. Time moved forward indifferent to the moments Margaret wished she could hold on to forever. The seasons changed. The years slipped by, and with each passing day Bruno grew larger. What was once a small, helpless cub had now become a massive, towering bear. His thick fur gleaming in the sunlight, Margaret often found herself staring at him, marveling at the creature he had become. He could stand on his hind legs and reach the highest branches, his sheer size enough to make even the bravest of hunters tremble. Yet to her, he was still the same cub she had once carried in her arms. The village, however, saw him differently, people whispered. When she walked into town for supplies, some kept their distance. Others outright warned her, "One day he will turn on you." An elder woman had muttered, shaking her head. Margaret never argued. She simply smiled, knowing they would never understand. Bruno was not just a bear to her, he was a companion, a protector. The closest thing to family she had left. Bruno, despite his intimidating size, remained gentle. He learned how to carry things carefully, using his massive paws to drag fallen logs toward the cabin, saving Margaret the strain. If she ever dropped something, he would pick it up with his teeth and place it at her feet. He understood her in ways no one else did. When Margaret spoke, Bruno would tilt his head, his dark eyes locked onto hers as though he could comprehend her words. He knew when she was happy, and more importantly, he knew when she was sad on nights, when loneliness crept in. When Margaret sat by the fireplace, staring at the old rocking chair her husband once occupied, Bruno would rest his heavy head on her lap, huffing softly as if telling her she was not alone. Years passed, and though Bruno remained strong, Margaret did not. Her hands, once steady, now trembled when she held a teacup. Her steps came slower, her back more bent. The cold air that once invigorated her now sent painful shivers through her bones. Bruno noticed, where once he would roam around the forest, he now never strayed far from her side. If she struggled to stand, he would nudge her gently with his nose. Helping her balance when she walked, he moved slowly beside her, matching her pace. Margaret knew her time was drawing near. She did not fear death. She had lived a full life, and though it had been lonely for many years, Bruno had given her something she never thought she would have again. Love. One evening, as she sat on the porch watching the sun dip below the mountains, she reached out and ran her fingers through Bruno's thick fur. "You will be alone again one day, my dear," she murmured, her voice barely above a whisper. Bruno let it out, a soft, deep sound, pressing his large head against her frail shoulder. Margaret closed her eyes, feeling the warmth of the massive creature beside her, she hoped. When the time came, he would understand. That night, as the fire crackled softly inside the cabin, Margaret lay in her bed, the blankets tucked tightly around her. Bruno curled up near the doorway, his massive body rising and falling with each breath. The room was silent except for the faint rustling of wind. Outside, Margaret closed her eyes, her body exhausted, her heart full. She never woke up again. The morning sun filtered through the wooden slats of the cabin, casting golden streaks across the floor. But Margaret did not rise to greet the day. The warmth of the sunlight touched her wrinkled hands, motionless beneath the blankets. Her breathing had ceased sometime in the night, her body finally surrendering to the ears. Bruno stirred near the doorway. his large frame shifting slightly as he let out a soft huff. He was used to waking before Margaret, waiting patiently for her to rise from bed, watching as she made tea and sat by the window. But something was different today. He waited and waited still. Margaret did not move. Bruno let out a low whimper, his heavy paws patting toward the bed. He nudged her hand with his nose, expecting the usual sleepy murmur, the gentle stroke of her fingers through his fur. But there was nothing. The room was silent. A deep guttural sound rumbled from Bruno's chest, a sorrowful moan that carried through the cabin. He nudged her again, harder this time, but Margaret remained still. Bruno did not understand death the way humans did, but he understood absence. He understood that something had changed, in a way that could never be undone, for the first time since she had found him. Bruno felt truly alone. The village remained unaware of Margaret's passing. For several days, the widow rarely came into town, and no one noticed her absence immediately. It was only when a neighbor, concerned by the lack of smoke rising from her chimney, decided to visit. As the man approached the cabin, a strange unease settled in his chest. The door was slightly ajar. Swinging with the wind, he called Margaret's name, but there was no response. Then he saw the bear. Bruno sat motionless beside the bed, his massive form hunched, his dark eyes locked onto Margaret's lifeless body. The air was thick with something unspoken, something heavier than grief itself. The man took a cautious step forward, but Bruno growled a deep warning sound that made the hairs on the back of his neck stand up. The bear refused to let anyone near her. Words spread quickly through the village. People gathered outside, whispering, unsure of what to do. Many had feared this moment for years, believing the bear would one day become a danger. But this was not the rage of a wild animal. This was sorrow. Bruno did not lash out. He did not destroy the cabin in a blind fury. He simply remained there, unmoving, his great body curled protectively around the bed, as if he could somehow shield Margaret from what had already happened days past. And still he did not leave her side. He did not eat, did not drink. His breaths were slow, his once powerful body growing weaker. With each passing hour, the villagers did not know what to do. One evening, as the sun dipped below the mountains, Bruno finally moved with deliberate slowness. He rose to his feet. His massive paws stepped gently over the wooden floor as he reached down, taking the edge of Margaret's blanket in his teeth. The villagers watched in the stunned silence as Bruno lifted her carefully, as though she were made of the most fragile glass. Then, without a single glance at the people outside, he carried her out of the cabin, and he walked not toward the village, not toward the wild forest. Beyond, he was going somewhere, only he knew somewhere, that meant something to her, somewhere she belonged. The villagers stood frozen as Bruno carried Margaret's lifeless body through the snow-covered ground. No one dared to move, no one spoke. There was something sacred about the moment, something beyond their understanding. Bruno walked with slow, deliberate steps, his massive paw pressing deep into the earth. The weight of his grief was visible in the way his head hung low, in the way his eyes, once filled with gentle warmth, now carried a sorrow that seemed too human for a beast he did not go toward. The village, he did not seek shelter. Instead, he took her to the one place that had always been hers, the hill overlooking the valley. It was the place where Margaret had spent countless evenings, wrapped in her wool shawl, watching the golden light fade behind the mountains. She had often sat there in silence, her gaze lost in the horizon, as though searching for something she knew would never return. Bruno carried her there, stepping carefully over the snow-covered rocks. When he reached the top, he looked low at her gently onto the ground, nudging her as if hoping she would wake. But she remained still. A long, mournful sound rumbled from Bruno's chest, deep and haunting. It was not an angry growl, nor a cry of hunger. It was a sound of loss of a creature that had loved and was now left alone in a world that no longer made sense. The villagers, hesitant but drawn by something greater than fear, Followed from a distance, they watched as Bruno sat beside Margaret, his massive frame hunched over as though trying to shield her from the cold. One of the elders whispered, "I have never seen anything like this." No one had hours passed, and Bruno did not move. The sky darkened, the temperature dropped, but he remained at her side. The villagers, now standing at the base of the hill, murmured among themselves. They did not know what to do. Some wanted to intervene to take Margaret's body and give her a proper burial. Others believed it was not their place. Then, as one of the men took a cautious step forward, Bruno let out a deep growl. It was not one of aggression, but of warning. They understood this was not their moment. This was his, as the moon cast its silver light over the land. Bruno did something that no one in the village would ever forget. With his massive claws, he began to dig, not with the reckless fury of an animal, but with care, with purpose. The ground was frozen, unyielding, but Bruno did not stop. The villagers watched in stunned silence as he worked tirelessly, the muscles in his shoulders rippling with each movement. He dug deep, his breath visible in the frigid air. He was not simply digging, he was burying her. A task that should have belonged to humans was now being carried out by the very creature they had once feared. The grave was not perfect, not shaped with the precision of human hands, but it was enough to hold the only person he had ever loved. With one final, sorrowful glance, Bruno lowered Margaret's body into the earth. He nudged the blanket that covered her, as though saying a final goodbye, before using his powerful paws to cover her with the dirt. When the task was done, he sat there, unmoving. The villagers, overwhelmed by the raw grief of the moment, could do nothing but watch. Bruno did not leave. That night he stayed by the grave, his massive body curled around it, protecting it from the cold. He did not eat, he did not sleep. He simply mourned. The wind howled through the valley, carrying the scent of winter and the weight of sorrow. The villagers, though hesitant, had gathered near the hilltop, watching from a respectful distance. No one dared to approach Bruno. No one had the heart to interrupt his mourning days past. Bruno remained beside the grave, his massive form still in silent. The once powerful bear who had towered over men and frightened wolves into retreat now seemed small, broken by the loss of the only person who had ever shown him kindness. He did not eat. He did not move. Some of the villagers, despite their lingering fear, left food near the edge of the clearing, hoping he would take it. But he did not. He merely sat there, his dark eyes locked onto the mound of earth that now held Margaret. The village elders, who had once warned Margaret about keeping a bear, now stood in quiet reverence. "He understands," one of them whispered. The others nodded. They too could see it. This was not the mindless instinct of a wild animal. This was grief in its purest form. One evening, a heavy snowfall covered the valley, blanketing the ground in thick white layers. When morning came, the villagers made their way up the hill again. Bruno was still there, his fur dusted with snow, unmoving. The grave remained undisturbed, as though he had spent the entire night guarding it. But something changed. The fire in his eyes, the quiet warmth that had once made him different from other wild creatures, was fading. The villagers whispered among themselves. Some believed he would stay there until he too passed away. Others thought he would one day return to the forest, reclaiming his place among his own kind. But Bruno had no kind. He had never known a mother's warmth. Beyond Margaret's gentle hands, he had never hunted, never lived like other bears. He had only known her, and now she was gone. Gone. On the morning of the third day, Bruno finally moved. He rose to his feet, his massive frame casting a long shadow across the snow-covered grave. The villagers held their breath, watching as he turned his head one last time toward the earth that held Margaret. Then, without a sound, he walked away. He did not look back. He moved with slow, heavy steps, disappearing into the thick forest. Beyond the valley, the villagers did not follow. They simply stood in silence, watching as the creature who had once frightened them, who had once protected their most unlikely neighbor, vanished into the wild. And just like that, Bruno was gone. But his story was not over for years to come. Travelers passing through the valley would speak of a lone bear wandering the mountains, a bear that did not hunt livestock, did not attack humans, but instead roamed as though searching for something he had lost on quiet nights. When the moon was high, some claim they saw his silhouette on the hilltop, sitting, watching, waiting, as though still guarding the grave of the only family he had ever known. The forest swallowed Bruno whole, its towering trees closing behind him like a curtain. He moved through the snow, his heavy paws leaving deep imprints in the earth, but his steps were slow, burdened by something heavier than his own weight. He had never known a life outside of Margaret's world. The cabin, the garden, the warmth of the fire on winter nights, those had been his home now, all of it was gone. Bruno wandered aimlessly, his large frame blending into the wilderness. He did not seek food, he did not seek shelter. He simply walked as though driven by an invisible force, as though searching for something that could never be found. Seasons changed, the snow melted, giving way to spring. But Bruno did not return to the village. The people who had once feared him now spoke of him with quiet reverence. They had witnessed something that defied logic, something that blurred the line between human and beast. He was not just a bear, one of the elders had said, and no one disagreed. Rumors spread. Beyond the village, travelers passing through the mountains told stories of a massive lone bear wandering, the valleys never attacking, never settling. Hunters who had once sought the thrill of the chase found themselves pausing when they saw him, their weapons lowering as an unexplained, able feeling crept into their hearts. Some said they saw him return to the hilltop, sitting silently beside Margaret's grave, his massive frame outlined against the sky. Others claimed he had disappeared entirely, vanishing into the deepest parts of the forest where no human had ever set foot. No one knew the truth, but what was undeniable was that the legend of the widow and her bear had taken on a life of its own years past, and the village itself changed. New families arrived, homes were rebuilt, roads were paved, but Margaret's cabin remained untouched, left, as it was a quiet monument to a life once lived. No one dared to tear it down, and deep in the mountains where the wind carried the whispers of forgotten stories, some believed that Bruno still roamed, that somewhere in the vast, uncharted wilderness, a bear still searched for the only home he had ever known. The story of Margaret and Bruno did not fade with time. It became something greater, something whispered from generation to generation. Children growing up in the village heard the tale from their elders, their eyes wide with wonder, as they imagined the enormous bear who had loved a human more than he had loved the wild. Margaret's cabin remained untouched, standing as a silent reminder of the bond that had defied nature itself. Travelers passing through often stopped to stare at the small weathered home, wondering if the story was true. Some swore they had seen Bruno, massive footprints near the hilltop, fresh in the dirt, as though he had returned once more. Others claimed they heard low, sorrowful sounds in the dead of night, a deep rumble that carried through the valley like an echo from the past. The villagers did not question these stories. They did not fear the bear anymore. Instead, they spoke of him with a quiet respect, as one would speak of a guardian spirit watching over the land. Margaret's son eventually returned, years too late. He stood in front of the abandoned cabin, staring at the door his mother had once opened every morning. He had left, seeking a better life, believing she would always be there when he came back. But time had moved without him. He visited the hill where she had been buried. He had expected a simple grave, perhaps overgrown with grass, forgotten with the seasons. What he found was different. The land around it was untouched, the grave as it had been the day she was laid to rest. No signs of disturbance, no traces of time erasing her memory. It was as if someone had been guarding it all these years. He knelt, running his fingers through the cold earth, regret filling the spaces where love should have been. He had lost his mother long before she died, and she had not been alone when she left this world. As he stood ready to leave, he felt it. A presence. He turned, scanning the tree line, but there was nothing there, just the rustling of leaves, the whisper of the wind, yet deep in his chest. He knew somewhere in the endless wilderness the bear still watched, still remembered, still mourned. The story of the widow and her bear became more than just a tale. It became a legend, a testament to a bond that should not have existed, but did a reminder that love in its truest form did not recognize species, did not obey the laws of nature. It simply existed, and somewhere in the mountains on quiet nights when the moon was full, a lone bear still wandered, searching for the only home he had ever known. If this story moved you, imagine the countless other incredible tales waiting to be told. Love, loyalty, and the unexpected bonds between humans and animals remind us of the power of connection. If you want more stories that touch the heart and keep you on the edge of your seat, make sure to subscribe to the channel and turn on notifications. There's so much more to discover, and you won't want to miss what comes next.